and welcome to Pack 75.
Welcome to Pack 75.
Hi, and welcome to Pack 75.
I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Arts and Humanities here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it gives me great pleasure to open the Pack 75 Viewing the Past and Looking to the Future celebrations to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress held here in Manchester in 1945. Our online programme enables us to connect with audiences around the world, and I am delighted to announce that one of our keynote speakers, Kwame Appiah, will broadcast his speech live from his home in Princeton, USA. We are proud to be working in association with all three Greater Manchester universities and other institutions, including See My World, Contact Theatre, National Black Arts Alliance, Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage, and the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Centre. Most importantly, we are pleased that this event has had the full involvement of students from across Manchester's universities, participating in interviews, running a Sunday programme, and being important collaborators in the Pack 75 celebrations. It is particularly special that we are hosting this event in Black History Month with the involvement of our students. They have engaged with passion and enthusiasm and will take the learning from these events to future generations. So, thank you for listening, stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the programme of events that we've curated for you. Thank you, and bye for now.
I'd like to say to viewers, you're going to have a really interesting time watching this. We know it's a very different period than what we had originally planned, but we're really looking forward to what will be an amazing online festival of events.
Hello and welcome to the Pan-African Congress 75th anniversary celebrations, and thank you for joining us for the next event. This is an open space where we encourage questions, which we ask you to do in a respectful manner. Hate speech will not be tolerated. Please be aware that this webinar and the Q&A session is being recorded. We will be uploading it to our YouTube channel tomorrow for you to view again and share with your friends and colleagues. If you'd like to post any questions at any point during Anthony Appiah's talk and the following discussion, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'd now like to introduce Professor Ola Uduku. Thank you.
Hello everybody and good evening, and welcome to the second day and the last event of the Pan-African Congress at 75 celebrations, which are taking place virtually from Manchester Metropolitan University. Today, or this evening, it's my great pleasure to welcome our keynote talk person, who is Professor Kwame Appiah. Before we listen to his keynote talk, I will give an introduction to him, and again, we are very grateful for him to be here. So, Kwame Appiah is the son of Joe Appiah, who was in attendance at the 5th Pan-African Conference in Manchester in 1945. Joe Appiah went on to become an eminent lawyer, and he then was a politician in Ghana's First Republic, and also led the Joint Opposition Party in Ghana from 1970 to 72. Joe Appiah was also Ghana's representative at the United Nations. His mother, Peggy Nay Stafford Cripps, was the daughter of Sir Stafford Cripps, who was the British Labour government's Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1947 to 1950. Anthony was born in London, but grew up in Kumasi, Ghana, and was educated at Cambridge. His Clare College PhD thesis, Conditions for Conditionals, was published in 1981. He is a naturalized American philosopher, cultural theorist, and novelist whose interests include political and moral theory, the philosophy of language and mind, and African intellectual history. He has taught at the universities of Ghana, Cornell, Yale, and Harvard. He credits his meeting with Louise Gates as that which led him to visiting the United States in the first place and eventually taking up a position at Yale. He later on collaborated with Gates on the editing of Africana, the encyclopedia of the African and African American experience. He was the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University professor of philosophy at Princeton University before moving to New York University in 2014. At NYU, he holds the joint appointments at the Department of Philosophy and the School of Law. He has written widely on culture and philosophy, and his novels include Avenging Angels, Nobody Likes Letitia, and Another Death in Venice. His books include In My Father's House, Color Conscious, and The Ethics of Identity. He presented the Reith Lecture in 2016 on the theme Mistaken Identities. His most recent book has been The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, Creed, Country, Color, Class, and Culture. And this was published in 2018. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Kwame Anthony Appiah, and we will now listen to his talk. And after that, there'll be a short period of conversation where we hope you're going to join us in the event.
In 1900, in an address to the nations of the world at the first Pan-African conference in London, W.B. Du Bois proclaimed that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the colour line, the question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the colour of the skin and the texture of the hair, will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. Du Bois believed correctly, as it turned out, that combating white supremacy would be a major challenge in the politics of the century to come. And because he was not remotely parochial in his interests or his analyses, when he said that race was to be the problem of the 20th century, he didn't just mean in his own country, and he didn't just mean for his own race. He saw the colour line as a battle on at least two fronts, challenging racism in Europe and the Americas on the one hand, and defeating the racism of Europe's colonial empires on the other. He was talking, as he said, about over half the world. Elsewhere in the speech, he spoke not just of the millions of black men in Africa, America, and the islands of the sea, but of the brown and yellow myriads elsewhere. So Du Bois in 1900 had very much in mind the ways in which race figured in the European colonial schemes that were reshaping Africa and Asia, as well as its role in the American social injustices he had experienced at first hand. It's worth remembering that European colonial conquest in Africa was still very much underway when he spoke to the delegates in London at the dawn of a new century. In West Africa, the final British conquest of Kumasi, Ashanti's capital, the town in Ghana where I grew up, occurred just a week before the London conference began. And the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria was only conquered in 1903. In the north of the continent, Morocco became a French protectorate in 1912, Egypt a British one in 1914. To the east, Ethiopia remained independent until 1936, and then became again so 5 years later. To the south, the Boer War was still in bloody progress when Du Bois spoke. In all of these African conflicts, notions of race played a crucial role, and after the Congress of Berlin, which defined Europe's shared understanding of the terms of her African empires, the status of the subject peoples in the Belgian, British, French, German, Spanish and Portuguese colonies of Africa, as well, of course, as in independent South Africa, had been defined in racial terms. Civic and economic inequality between races and ethnicities, whether produced by government policy, by private discrimination, or by the very complex interactions between the two of them, were pervasive features of states at the start of the 20th century, and they remain so long after that first Pan-African conference was but a distant memory. All around the world, people know of the struggle of African Americans and of South Africans for racial equality, but political struggles over racial inequality have been central in the politics of Australia, New Zealand, and most of the countries of the Americas as well, whether the racial groups seeking justice were First Peoples or the descendants of African slaves or South or East Asian indentured labourers. This too was part of what Du Bois had in mind. Over time, as non-Europeans, including many citizens of Europe's former empires in Asia and Africa, have migrated into Europe in increasing numbers, questions of racial inequality in rights, in education, in employment and housing, and in income and wealth have come to the fore there too. Japanese and Chinese people were, in Du Bois's mind, on the same side of the colour line as he was because they weren't white. But the condescension and worse displayed towards China by the Japanese in the decades between the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 5 and World War II is naturally thought of as a form of racism also, as are the anti-African attitudes reported by black visitors who hear themselves being described as Heigui in China. Among the hundreds of thousands of Chinese now working in Africa, racial condescension of the sort familiar from the European colonial period is common. And alas, anti-Chinese attacks have occurred in many African countries in recent years too. While these East Asian attitudes may have roots in earlier traditions of the sort of xenophobia that's found historically all around the planet, they're surely no longer independent of racial attitudes that came from the traditions of Europe and North America. Racial discrimination and insult remain a global problem. Du Bois's address to the Pan-African Conference was an invitation to a global politics of race, in which people of African descent could join with people of colour from elsewhere to end white supremacy, both in the global system and in their various homes. That politics shaped the politics of decolonisation in Africa and the Caribbean, and informed the creation of the Organisation of African Unity and the African Union. It was a politics that led Du Bois to become, by the end of his life, a Ghanaian citizen, a politics that explained why he was welcomed by President Nkrumah to newly independent Ghana, invited there to head up the project of creating the first encyclopedia of the black world. But the first project that Du Bois and Nkrumah worked on together was the 5th Pan-African Congress here in Manchester, 45 years after that address about the colour line. The planning for the Congress was a genuinely Pan-African affair in the sense that it involved people from the three central strands of the Pan-African movement: African Americans, black people from the Caribbean, and people from Africa. Du Bois, the senior figure, represented the African American part of the Troika, a reminder that the movement had been created in the African diaspora. Henry Sylvester Williams, the co-convener of the 1900 Congress, was a Jamaican who seems to have coined the term Pan-Africanism. Representing the Caribbean in 1945, we can take George Padmore, the Trinidadian Marxist, educated in the United States, who'd been living in London since 1934. He'd been for a while the head of the Red International of Labour Unions in Moscow and worked for the Communist Party in Austria and in Germany in the early 1930s, but was deported when the Nazis came to power. But he turned away from communism to Pan-Africanism as the Soviet Union seemed to him to have abandoned its support for decolonisation. In 1937, Padmore had published Africa and World Peace with, as it happens, an introduction by my English grandfather, Stafford Cripps, Tony Benn's predecessor as the Labour Party MP for Bristol East, who wrote, "We have so many of us been brought up in the atmosphere of, quote, the white man's burden, and have had our minds clouded and confused by the continued propaganda for imperialism, that we may be almost shocked by this bare and courageous exposure of the great myth of the civilizing mission of Western democracies in Africa." Representing the continent in the Troika was Kwame Nkrumah, newly arrived from his university education at a black college in the United States, Lincoln University, with a letter of introduction to Padmore, given to him by Padmore's boyhood friend C.L.R. James. Padmore met Nkrumah off the train in London from the boat from America. Padmore was part of a large circle of black people in London at the time, which included many West Africans brought together by WASU, the West African Students' Union, and the International African Service Bureau, which C.L.R. James had helped start in 1935, when progressive people were organising against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. But in the same circle were Kamuzu Banda from Nyasaland and Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya. It was through Padmore that Nkrumah got to know my Ghanaian father in the first days in London, though as fellow Gold Coasters they would probably have met soon anyway. My father was one of the other young Africans who came to Manchester from London, and he went on to be Nkrumah's representative in London in the early 1950s and the president of WASU. So here's my father's account of the opening of the Congress from his autobiography. The real business of the conference began on Monday the 15th at 10 a.m. under the chairmanship of Mrs. Marcus Garvey, widow of the great Marcus Garvey. Dr. Peter Millard, the president of the Pan-African Federation of Great Britain, delivered the opening address. The afternoon session began with the arrival of the Lord Mayor of Manchester, Alderman W.P. Jackson, who in a short speech expressed his pleasure at being invited, his concern for the coloured residents of the city, and his best wishes for the success of our conference. So the real significance of the fifth conference is that it represented the arrival on the international scene of a generation of young leaders from the continent itself. Among them, not just Nkrumah, who was of course to be Ghana's first president, but Jomo Kenyatta and Hastings Banda, who played the same role in Kenya and Malawi, and Obafemi Awolowo, who was the first premier of Nigeria's western region, and his successor, Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola. And there were also many others, like my father, who was a member of Ghana's first post-independence parliament and went on to be president of the Ghana and then the West African Bar Association, men and women who served in the new states at the top levels of the private and the public sectors. They were a close-knit group. When Nkrumah was unable to come to London to be the best man at my father's wedding, he delegated Padmore to do the job instead. I said that the Pan-African movement was created in the diaspora by figures like Du Bois and Henry Sylvester Williams. It was outside Africa that the descendants of those enslaved in the New World developed a continental identity. On the Caribbean plantations, the enslaved were deliberately discouraged from sticking together in groups of people who came from the same places and spoke the same languages. That way lay the possibility of slave revolts. Most of the enslaved would never have met people of a wide range of African societies if they hadn't been enslaved. They would not have thought of each other as belonging together under a single identity until they discovered that they got the same treatment from Europeans. The friendships formed by Africans from the colonies working or studying Britain and France in the mid-20th century had a similar effect. As Chinua Achebe once told me when we met to talk in Cambridge in England, there is an African identity coming into existence, and it has a certain context and a certain meaning. Because if somebody meets me, say in a shop in Cambridge, and says, "Are you from Africa?" he says, "Are you from Africa?" which means that Africa means something to some people. Each of these tags has a meaning and a penalty and a responsibility. But this process was still relatively new in 1945. The cultural life of most of tropical Africa remained largely unaffected by European ideas until the last years of the 19th century, and most people in most cultures began the last century, the 20th century, with ways of life formed very little by direct contact with Europe or Europeans. Direct trade with Europeans, and especially the slave trade, had structured the economies of many of the states of the West African coast and its hinterland from the mid-17th century onwards, replacing the extensive gold trade which had existed at least since Carthaginian Empire in the 2nd century before the Common Era. By the early 19th century, as the slave trade went into decline, palm nut and groundnut oils had become major exports to Europe, and these were followed later by cocoa and by coffee. But the direct colonization of the region began in earnest only in the later 19th century, and European administration of the whole of West Africa was only accomplished after much resistance, as I said, when the Sokoto Caliphate was conquered in 1903. On the Indian Ocean, the eastward trade, which sent gold and slaves to Arabia and exchanged spices, incense, ivory, coconut oil, timber, grain and pig iron from India for Indian silk and fine textiles, and pottery and porcelain from Persia and China had dominated the economies of the East African littoral until the coming of the Portuguese disrupted the trade in the late 15th century. From then on, European trade became increasingly predominant, but in the mid-19th century, the major force in the region, from the economic point of view, was the Arab Omanis, who had captured Mombasa from the Portuguese more than a century earlier. Using enslaved labour from the African mainland, the Omanis developed the profitable clove trade of Zanzibar, making it, by the 1860s, the world's major producer. But in most of East Africa, as in the West, extended direct contact with Europeans was a late 19th century phenomenon, and colonisation occurred essentially only after 1885. In the south of the continent, in the areas where Bantu-speaking people predominate, few cultures had had any contact with Europeans before 1900. By the end of the century, the region had adopted many new crops for the world economy. Imports of firearms manufactured in the newly industrialised West had created a new political order based often on force, and European missionaries and explorers, of whom David Livingstone was for Westerners the epitome, had travelled almost everywhere in the region. The administration of Southern Africa from Europe was established in law only by the ending in 1902 of the Boer War. Not surprisingly then, European cultural influence in Africa before the 20th century was extremely limited. There are interesting exceptions, such as the Portuguese penetration of the Congo Kingdom, whose king, Nzinga Nkuwu, converted to Christianity in 1485. Despite attempts at change, deliberate attempts at change through missionary activity or the establishment of Western schools, and unintended influence through contact with explorers and colonizers in the interior and trading posts on the coasts, produced small enclaves of Africans literate in European languages and educated in European traditions, but the major cultural impact of Europe is largely a product of the period after the First World War. So it only began about 100 years ago. We can find generalizations at a certain abstract level about pre-colonial Africa, no doubt, but if we could have travelled through Africa's many cultures in those years, from the small groups of Bushmen, hunter-gatherers with their Stone Age materials, to the Hausa kingdoms rich in worked metal, we should have felt in every place profoundly different impulses, ideas, and forms of life. To speak of an African identity in the 19th century, if an identity is a coalescence of mutually responsive, if sometimes conflicting, modes of conduct, habits of thought, and patterns of evaluation, in short, a coherent kind of human social psychology, that would have been a fantasy. The modern Pan-African identity, to repeat the point, begins in moments like the Pan-African Congresses, and with the shared background and the shared experiences of colonial subjection and racial subordination of some of the people who came together at those congresses. The new Pan-African identity, forged in Manchester, was brought to bear successfully in the shared struggle against empire. But it was then put to new uses as the African continent was decolonized. One of Nkrumah's first projects was the Organization of African Unity that brought the newly decolonized African states into a single transnational body, which transformed eventually into the African Union as it exists today. Du Bois's Encyclopedia Africana, his last project, became a project of the OAU. But the cosy fellowship of African colonial students in London or Manchester did not necessarily turn into easy collaboration across the boundaries of post-colonial states. And part of the reason for this was simple. The vast majority of the African population never experienced life as Africans in the metropole, in London, in Manchester, in Paris. For the first time in a Pan-African Congress, among the Pan-Africanists in Manchester, there were also delegates from African trades unions, cooperative societies, and farmers, and it would be good to try to recover what must have been their sense that the solidarity of their brethren who lived in Britain was something that they had yet to learn. Even in the metropole, divisions from back home could get in the way of unity. In WASU, the West African Students' Union, my father had to deal in the 1950s with tensions between Yoruba and Igbo-speaking people from what was to be independent Nigeria. One problem we can now see then with the Pan-African identity was that it was based in the thought that black people already had more in common than they actually did. Part of that was the result of an inheritance of European racial thinking. What was shared in the common experience of colonized Africans was in part the result of the fact that they were thought to belong to a single Negro race and to have a great deal naturally in common for that reason. But nothing could be more striking for someone without preconceptions than the extraordinary diversity of Africa's people and its cultures. I still vividly recall the overwhelming sense of difference that I experienced when I first travelled out of Western to Southern Africa. Driving through the semi-arid countryside of Botswana into her capital Gaborone, only a day away by plane from the tropical vegetation of Asante, no landscape could have seemed more alien. The material culture of the Botswana too struck me as quite radically different from that of Asante. In Gaborone, unlike Asante, men dressed in shirts and trousers, most women in skirts and blouses, and most of these clothes were unpatterned, so that the streets lacked the colour of the flowing Asante ntumala cloth, and the idioms of carving, of weaving, of pottery, and of dance were all unfamiliar. Inevitably, in such a setting, I wondered what, in Botswana, was supposed to follow from our being fellow Africans. And this matters for a simple reason. People who think they have a great deal naturally in common don't always realise that solidarity is something you can't assume, that it has to be made. This is an especially significant problem, I think, in the other politics of Pan-Africanism, not the one that tries to bring the continent together, but the one that tries to yoke the continent and the diaspora. You can see this in a book like Black Gold of the Sun, written by Eko Eshun, a black British writer and editor-in-chief of the magazine Tank, and former director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts. He's the child of Ghanaian diplomats, exiled in Britain by the vicissitudes of Ghanaian politics, and the book tells the story of a return to Ghana in 2001, at the age of 33, driven in part by his alienation from the routine racism of English life. He writes of going to Ghana because I have no home. He discovers that the hip-hop that had provided him as a black British teenager with a vocabulary of identity is also a source of meaning for the young people he meets in the clubs of Accra. America's black music binds the three vertices, Europe, Africa, and the New World, of Africa's Atlantic diaspora, and the style that has grown up around hip-hop music in particular has become the idiom of urban youth culture throughout the diaspora. Eshun's Fanti family comes from Cape Coast. Travelling there in search of routes that he can explore with a precision that New World returnees must envy, he discovers, almost inevitably, given the city's history, that the prosperity that made his parents' modern education possible has its roots in the fortune made through slaving by an ancestor he calls, quote, the mulatto Joseph de Graft. He finds himself consumed with shame. He's left England, quote, partly because of the pervasive racism there, only to find my ancestor had collaborated in establishing its tenets. Eshun is a British success story. The visit to Ghana may have shown him that it was not his home, but it doesn't seem to have reconciled him fully to Britain. The alienation of many in the black middle class in England has echoes in the alienation of many successful African Americans. But because he isn't an American, despite his immersion in hip-hop, Eko Eshun hears Ghanaian complaints about African American returnees. A tourist guide in Accra tells him, they said to me, we are Africans who live in America. We took them to the slave fort at Elmina. They all cried when they saw the dungeons. They poured libation for the souls of their ancestors. But after a while I saw it was all words to them. They acted so high and proud as if we were their servants, and they were the real Africans. Misconceptions like these are explored in Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, a finely crafted account of many misunderstandings between the slaves, the children of the slaves, the enslaved who went to the New World, and the descendants of those they left behind. Raised in New York, she was baptized Valerie Hartman, but took the Swahili name Saidiya in college in a gesture of identification with Africa. I had found it in an African names book. She says it means helper. Professor Hartman, who's taught at Berkeley and is now a professor at Columbia University, travelled to Ghana first in 1996 for a few weeks of tourism before returning for a year as a Fulbright scholar in 1997. The book begins in alienation, with the recognition that the name Obroni, which greets her on the laughing lips of the children of Elmina, is the Akan word for a stranger. What's fascinating is the combination of cool analysis and burning resentment. Hartman understands, but will not forgive. In my estimation, I was the aggrieved. To others, I was a privileged American, she writes. She knows that her annual salary as a Fulbright scholar was more than the average Ghanaian would earn in several lifetimes. She knows that more than half the people of Ghana are themselves the descendants of enslaved people. And she knows that the young people she talks to never enslaved anyone. She knows that the racism of her American home, if it is a legacy of slavery, is not the responsibility of any Ghanaian. But she cannot escape the feeling that despite all this, every Ghanaian owes her something. Visiting Salaga, the old slave trading city in the north of Ghana, she sees, quote, a raiding empire fattened by the slave trade. But the teacher she speaks to there sees only his own people suffering. The Manchester Congress was focused on decolonisation. That was a project that easily brought Africans together. But it wasn't a shared culture or race that made it work. It was a shared problem, the problem of racial empire. And the Congresses were the product of a solidarity created to face that problem. The Pan-Africanism that they were creating wasn't designed to help Saidiya Hartman get back to Ghana. Now remember that Du Bois's politics of the colour line had a dual agenda. One part was to deal with the colonisation and the racial imperialism, but the other was to deal with racism in the home of white supremacy. In this new century, in a world after European empire, the struggle for black equality in Europe and the Americas has been reinvigorated by the Black Lives Matter movement. At the heart of Atlantic slavery was a system of racial status. The richest, most highly educated, most talented black person, someone like Du Bois, ranked below the poorest, least educated, least gifted white person in that system. If you were black, any white person was supposed to be able to look down on you. Indeed, as Du Bois pointed out, that was, in a sense, the social contract between a white elite and the white underclass. In return for accepting class subordination, poor whites got to experience racial pride. This was not necessarily true in the colonial metropoles in places like Manchester and London. My father's autobiography contains a record of friendships and flirtations with white Britons that would have astonished an African American in his day. And in the end, he came home to Ghana with a British wife in a marriage that would still have been illegal in many American states when I was a teenager. And by the later part of the last century, blackness in Britain was changing in interesting ways. One reason was the development of a new concept of political blackness that treated black as an umbrella term that encompassed people from Asia and the Middle East, as well as those from Africa and its diaspora, in ways foreshadowed by Du Bois's talk of the colour line. That's not to say that it was the sturdiest of umbrellas. The heyday of political blackness in Britain stretched from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, and it was never uncontested. But I think it may have lessons for us today. In the UK, when I say us, I mean us in the United States. In the UK, its legacy remains legible. 3 years ago, in a public awareness campaign designed to increase voter turnout among British minorities, Operation Black Vote, Riz Ahmed appeared on a video. Black don't vote, he said, and by black people I mean ethnic minorities of all background. The year before, the Student Union of the University of Kent promoted Black History Month with the faces of 6 iconic figures. Alongside 4 famous Brits of African descent, it posted 2 of Pakistani heritage, Zayn Malik, the pop star, and Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. During its roughly 2 decades of prominence, the political blackness movement, taking note of how Britishness had routinely been equated with whiteness, valued coalition among non-white minority groups with a particular focus on the Afro-Asian alliance, so-called. Context always matters. In Britain, for example, the term Asian defaults to South Asian, whereas in the United States it defaults to East Asian. During the 1980s, the inclusive usage of black went mainstream in Britain, as you know. The Commission for Racial Equality, established in 1976, decided that Asian would be a subcategory of black. Other such organisations followed suit. And the bien-pensants among the children of empire started styling themselves as black, whether or not they had sub-Saharan ancestors, as Riz Ahmed has. This usage of black scanted the enormous differences among Britain's various non-white minorities. But that was exactly its point. That was its power. And the great British cultural theorist, Stuart Hall, you could see his elegant figure on British television in those days with his close-cropped beard and his well-fitted blazers, lecturing for the Open University, was always warning against the way race presented itself as a natural fact about human beings. Using black as an umbrella term would weaken illusions like that. It would helpfully emphasize the immense diversity and differentiation, as he once put it, of the historical and cultural experiences of black subjects. In an influential essay on new ethnicities, he heralded a film by John Akomfrah, whose father, like mine, had been a Ghanaian politician. But he also cited Hanif Qureishi's two collaborations with the director Stephen Frears, My Beautiful Laundrette and Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, as significant contributions to black British cinema. That neither Qureishi nor Frears was of African descent didn't make the work less black. In an influential 1987 book entitled There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, a younger scholar, Paul Gilroy, pointed to the unifying tendencies of racist activity, which regard the racial characteristics of people of Asian and of African descent as being equally worthy of hatred. Gilroy, known for his forceful lecturing style and his long leonine mane of dreadlocks, saw the umbrella term as a way to resist what he called a conception of cultural differences as fixed, solid, almost biological properties of human relations. Even in its heyday, though, proponents of political blackness wrangled with all kinds of resistance, especially as the 1980s wore on. Gilroy decried the malign workings of special state policy and provisions for ethnic minorities, I'm quoting, invariably defined so that they coincide with the old idea of biological races, which contributed, he said, to the fracturing of the inclusive definition of black. The sort of thing he had in mind was the way the public service network on Channel 4 segmented its programming, so that its weekly magazine show alternated between an Asian-focused Eastern Eye and the West Indian-focused Black on Black, consigning each, Gilroy felt, to its own ideological Bantustan. Some lamented the eclipse of a radical black political culture by a turn to ethnic enclaves and feuding nationalisms, this is Sivanandan, fomenting parochial discord among those who should be allied against a racial order that excluded them equally. The most outspoken opponents of political blackness charged that Asians were being forced into a template set by Afro-Caribbeans. The sociologist Tariq Madood, who pointed to a survey that suggested only a third of British Asians identified as black, believed Asians suffered more from racial prejudice in British society than people of African descent did. White working class youths were drawn to Afro-Caribbean culture, he said, while turning against Asians. It galled him, too, to see anti-racist programs focused on Afro-Caribbeans when most non-white Brits were Asian. And there's no doubt that high-minded aspirations to shared struggle didn't necessarily reflect the social reality on the street, which could be less harmonious. Claire Alexander, a professor of sociology right here at the University of Manchester, has dryly recalled that when she did her fieldwork in the late 1980s about how British black youth created their cultural identities, quote, one of my main informants, Darnell, commented, laughing, "You know, Claire, blacks and Asians don't get on." Yet the various criticisms of the idea of political blackness present quandaries of their own. Sure, it didn't give voice to all the differences it encompassed, but it was meant to supplement and not supplant the many other sources of identities in people's lives. Besides, the term Asian itself ignores the immense internal diversity of the group it designates. Among British Asians, Sikhs and Hindus don't vote the way Muslims do. Islamophobia targeted Asians, but was also promulgated by some other Asians. Stuart Hall, warning against the fiction, either that all black people are good or indeed that all black people are the same, never had any illusions that Afro-Caribbeans were much of a muchness. Growing up in Jamaica, he recalled, nobody was ever called black, but colorism was rampant. His grandmother could distinguish 15 different hues of brown. Social groups, he knew, are fractal. By the logic of culture, creed, colour or kinship, you can always split them into smaller groups. So why can't you also lump them into larger groups as well? In Britain today, as looking at it from across the Atlantic, it seems to me that the arguments for splitting and lumping, for stressing specificity or commonality, remain unresolved. The Black Student Campaign, the largest organisation of non-white students in Britain and Europe, represents students of Asian and Arab heritage as well as those of African descent. A few years ago, chastened by critics of the Black umbrella, the Black Student Campaign decided that it needed a new name and asked members for suggestions. But that's what they're called today. When Riz Ahmed appeared in the public service announcement for Operation Black Vote, many people looked askance at his claim to an overarching black identity. The Guardian columnist Yomi Adegoke remarked, "When I'm followed around in an Afro-Caribbean hair shop or newsagent, an Asian vendor forgets all about political blackness and becomes far more preoccupied with blackness. Ahmed had a different perspective. As children in the 1980s, he wrote, "When my brother and I were stopped near our home by a skinhead who put a knife to my brother's throat, we were black." If you want a term for white people, some people say, why not use people of colour? Well, Damon Young, the best-selling American memoirist, calls people of colour, quote, "a valueless catch-all that extinguishes identity instead of amplifying it." Jason Parham has dismissed people of colour as an idiomatic casserole of cultures and identities. If you mean black people, say black people. And such critics have a point. The hitch is that the term black people too is a casserole of cultures and identities. Anti-black racism is obviously a useful concept, but it's also an umbrella, casting its shade over the fact that in socio-economic terms, and now I'm speaking about the United States, British Caribbean immigrants and their children and grandchildren fare far better here than native African Americans, and those from the French and Spanish speaking Caribbean fare worse. Or that colorism within Black America can entail another set of disparities in treatment. And while some African Americans think people of colour is hopelessly expensive, others think the same of African Americans and want to make distinctions between people whose ancestors have been in the United States for a very long time and immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa, from other parts of the black world, of the world of Pan-Africanism. Getting the identity aperture wrong, drawing a circle that's too wide or too narrow, given your agenda, can lead to confusion or futility. Learning that a third of American Latinos support Trump, should we wonder whether something has gone terribly wrong with Vice President Biden's ethnic outreach? Or should we wonder instead whether a demographic category that suggests a similarity of interests between Ted Cruz, a leader of American conservatism, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the latest hero of the American left, may, for these purposes, be eliding distinctions that matter more. For these purposes is always the crucial qualifier. Those purposes can involve coalition politics, they can involve cultural interpretation, they can involve socio-economic precision. The point is that none of these identity terms is stenciled by the brute facts of the social world. Rather, they stencil themselves upon the social world. Each is invariably and inevitably a decision made jointly with others that arises from our interests and our objectives. If you don't like the available identity options, start a movement. You may be able to change them. As the architects of political blackness rightly insisted, collective identities are always the subject of contestation and negotiation. Political blackness may have had its day, but we're still coming to grips with its central insight. Blackness, like whiteness, has never not been political. And so when you need solidarity, you've got to build it. That was one of the things they certainly knew in Manchester in 1945. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's been a really enlightening talk. In fact, I think it's more like a lecture, but a really interesting one at that. You have a lot of fans who've been saying they would have liked to see you, so they can now see you. And I can say to our audience that he is not in front of a cocoa plantation, but it is a picture of a cocoa plantation. But thank you very much, Anthony.
It's a pleasure.
Just to get you going before I sort of start sending through the questions, since you are over the pond, What's your opinion at the moment then? We're post, we think, the last movement in terms of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and solidarity we had all over the world in the summer, but we're in the middle of the COVID crisis, part 1 or 2. But what's your view from over the pond?
Well, there's so many. I mean, I guess part of my point in the talk was just that what Pan-Africanism was trying to do was to bring together a very diverse bunch of people, and that's something that can be very worth doing, but you have to recognize the diversity, internal diversity, in order to make it work. You can't just assume that because everybody's a person of color, or now in the United States we say BIPOC, or one of these new expressions, just because that's true of them, and just because they're all subjected to some form of racism or other, it doesn't mean that they're already, all prepped to work together. I continue to think that, for example, the echoing of the Black Lives Matter movement around the world was useful, even though the situations of Black people in the many places where it came into focus were different. Obviously, the situation of Black people in Germany, where they had huge BLM protests in Berlin, is different from the situation in New York City, say. But I still think it's useful to sort of echo that kind of echo. I think it can be useful. And it happens that literally yesterday, in another Zoom session, I was attended a meeting whose physical base was in Ghana at the Du Bois Center in Accra, which is the old home where Dr. Du Bois and Shirley Graham, his wife, lived in Ghana at the end of his life. And in that meeting, we were all signing a memorandum of understanding, because we're going to be trying to raising money here in the United States, in the diaspora, to refurbish Du Bois's home so that it can become a center for Ghanaians to learn about Pan-Africanism, but also for African Americans and people from other parts of Africa to come and learn about it as a museum and a conference center. I wouldn't have done that if I thought it was a waste of time. So I wouldn't have been there. And people, the people who were there were, again, diverse people with lots of different interests. So I think my feeling is that provided you sort of don't make the mistake of assuming that the fact that you all fall under some label guarantees that you'll be able to work together. You've got to work hard to build solidarity. You've got to work hard to work together, and you've got to recognize what's now called intersectionality. You've got to recognize that I'm raised in a prosperous lawyer's house in a middle-class household in Ghana. My situation is different from the situation of working people in Ghana, but also of course, in other parts of the diaspora and in Europe. So I think it can be useful as long as we don't make that mistake. And useful for what? Well, for lots of things. I mean, one of the things it's useful for, and the government of Ghana has recognized this and is promoting it, is bringing people to Ghana, and through tourism, through cultural tourism, through identity tourism. That brings what tourism always brings. It brings money, but it also brings something of value to the people who are coming, if they're coming from the diaspora, because they're coming to see the place that they think of correctly as a representative, at least, of where their remote ancestors came from in the 18th and 19th centuries, before the formal abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. So I think that's just one example. It's useful. There are these problems of racism in China, anti-Black racism in China. Well, it's useful to put the weight of the African Union behind. It would be useful. It hasn't really happened yet, but it would be useful to put the weight of the African Union and of the diaspora, in play to remind the government of China that people are watching, and that if they want to have an important place on the world stage, which they do, they will have to shape up on questions of anti-Black racism, as well as on many other things, including their hostility to the Uyghurs in their own country and so on.
Thank you. Right, taking it to the audience, Claire Mumford, I'm going to try and abbreviate your question a bit. She sort of said, since you've spoken about Black identity, she would be very interested to hear to what extent you think the term racism is useful, or the fact that it just actually hinders conversations about inequality and discrimination. Is it too simplistic? What would you use as a term?
I think. Well, we could go back, I suppose, talk about the problem of the color line. We could follow Du Bois's original formulation. Du Bois didn't use the word racism a lot, actually. So I think the answer is the same answer as I would like to give about the idea of a Black identity or a Pan-African identity, which is racism can be a useful concept, but it sometimes, as you say, Claire, can get in the way. And it can get in the way in at least two kinds of way. One is that because of intersectionality, how something like white supremacy in the United States affects you depends on whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're middle class or working class, and so on. And so it's one thing to say, well, we all face problems of racism, but the problems of racism that people face depend upon other things about them, not just on the race that they've been assigned in the local system. So that's one kind of problem. It can risk smushing together things that actually need to be disaggregated in order to solve them. I'm not interested in separating things out just for conceptual reasons, but sometimes we have to separate things out in order to get to approach the problem and to do something about it. And the other thing I think is not so much whether racism is a useful concept or whether white supremacy, for that matter, is a useful concept, is whether, if you're trying to engage in conversation with people who are not Black, talk of racism or white supremacy, as it were, pushes them away from the conversation. And if you want to say, take another concept that we've used a lot recently, and it's a useful concept, but it has its problems too. That's the concept of privilege, white privilege. My own view is that white privilege has a useful advantage over talk of racism in that it doesn't ascribe responsibility to the person you're talking to for the problem you're talking about, because everybody knows that you can get privileges without asking for them or without making them for yourself. And so talk of white privilege allows you to say to non-Black people, look, what we're talking about is a problem in our society that it's structured in such a way that you get things that I don't get. And surely that's unfair. I'm not blaming you. I'm not here to wag a finger at you, but don't you think together we ought to figure out how to change the society so that it's fairer? And one thing that's needed to make it fairer is that we don't give people the advantages that have historically gone with whiteness. This is a different conversation in Britain from the conversation this is in the United States, because in Britain, a part of the problem of whiteness is the sort of sense that that white people are kind of naturally present in the British Isles and non-white people aren't. So, for example, and that leads us to ignore facts such as the fact that there was more European immigration to the United States after the Second World War than there was from the Caribbean and Africa. There are more new white Britons than, and this is before the European Union, the short history of the European Union in Britain. Now, thinking of your country as white is consistent with being awfully nice to non-white people. You can say, welcome, you non-white person. How wonderful it is to have some variety and color in our otherwise drab white country. But it's not the right way to think if you want to build a common citizenship, to think of it as belonging naturally to white people so that Black people have to be invited in. And I have this weird background, which means that I've been able from time to time to say to people, I have nothing against Black people in Britain. So to say, well, look, I'm pretty confident that I have more 12th century, identifiable 12th century British ancestors than you do. Because I know about Sir Guillaume de Crisp, who died in 1103 in Stanlake near Oxford, who's my grandfather's 14th great-grandfather in the male line. So, and I think that, but that's, of course, just playing the game. What you should do is reject the game. You should say, look, Citizenship is not about how long you or your genes or something like that, your ancestors, your genes have been somewhere. It's about building something together. And so, so that's a different problem, because in the United States, the people who can claim to be the people of the land are the Native Americans, the Indians. And white people can't claim that. They know that their ancestors only started arriving a couple of hundred years ago, and they know that black people started arriving at the same time, under very different conditions, of course.
Thank you. Now, there's a question that actually I think segues quite well into it from Yair Hashakar. I mean, I'm going to abbreviate it, but what he's really trying to say, I think, is because we have shared musical tastes, so he's thinking of hip hop, could there be a way in which a musical lingua franca around Africa and the African diaspora and world would be a way in which we could think about Pan-Africanism? So that's really coming straight back to your lecture where you talk about this shared identity.
Yes. Well, two thoughts. One is hip hop's awfully important now to lots of people in the world who wouldn't claim to be black. It's important to there's a hip hop culture in Japan, for example, and in China, and it's important to young people of all colors around the world. And it's one thing to use it to come together around a black identity, but it would be a sad thing to use it to exclude people from participation in it. And the second thing I want to say, and I'm always being told by my husband that I shouldn't say things like this because it makes me sound like an old fogey, but I don't actually know much about hip hop because I didn't grow up with it. It wasn't around in Ghana when I was growing up, and I haven't, I'm afraid, put in the effort to study it and get to know it in the way that perhaps my students would like me to. So I don't need a Pan-Africanism organized around hip hop, because I don't want to have to learn hip hop in order to participate in refurbishing the Du Bois Center in Accra. So I think people can, you can use things to come together. And one thing that Eko Eshon points out is in his book is that he was able to use hip hop, yes, to bring himself together with the kids in Accra, the young people in Accra, because they know hip hop. But he could have used it to come together with white people in New York as well, because most of the young people in New York of all classes know something about hip hop. So, so I think my tendency is to say, if you need solidarities, build them around whatever tools you have. If music is one of them, go ahead, but recognize that you'll need more than one tool. It'll never be enough. You need other tools as well. And B, that the tool you're using for building one lot of solidarity may actually get in the way with, me and old fogies like me, who don't really want to have to learn about hip hop in order to participate in black culture.
Well, thank you, Yair. But Yair does have a point. I know that some of the Nigerian hip hop artists have actually done the crossover, which again, in the old Black America was an issue as well. So they chart in the UK as well as charting in Nigeria. So you really do have this hip hop elite who speak their own language, but I think it's a language. So,
yes. Well, no. So I exactly. I think, music is one of the great transnational forces in our world today. Popular music and actually classical music, because some of the great classical pianists of today are Chinese. They have lots and lots of symphony orchestras in Japan. We have some classical music in Ghana. But yes, I mean, the idea that you can use music to build solidarity, I'm absolutely with that. And it just seems to me an important fact. And it's interesting because music in this way is different from some of the other arts, because the level of cultural preparation you need to say, enjoy somebody reciting the ancestry of the King of Ashanti in a beautiful royal poem. Well, that's, you have to learn a whole language, and you have to learn the most difficult part of the language to get to that. And and similarly, there's lots of wonderful literature in African languages that isn't in English or French or Spanish or Portuguese. And it's a real effort for people outside who don't speak those languages to get into it. You can't really appreciate Zulu praise poetry unless you learn Isizulu. So but music has this thing that, as it were, you can get into it at a low level of knowledge and somehow get drawn into it. And so I think of music as a very powerful transnational cosmopolitanizing force, a force for building identities across cultures. And that's, of course, one of the themes of Paul Gilroy's most famous book, Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, is about the ways in which in the transatlantic world, Black identity is organized historically around various kinds of popular music.
Thank you. Right, we've got Jade here, Jade Manslow-Ong from the University of Salford. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about our experience of the colour line in university contexts and your take on the current push to decolonize universities, curriculums, and so on. What would a decolonized university look like?
Well, so decolonization is at root part of a global process of democratization. It's about putting the people who were in the colonies back in charge of their own lives, having had them taken away for a while by people from somewhere else who didn't much care about what they thought about things. And I say that because it seems to me that democratizing universities, of which I think of decolonization, the movement as it were, part of that democratization, isn't something that you can do by declaring how it should be done. Democracy is about listening to people and letting people speak and figuring out together as teachers and students where we want the university to go. And that's difficult because there isn't one we. And I do think that if you want to change the culture, I mean, I should say, look, the last time I taught in a British university was in the early 80s. So I'm not exactly up to date on any of this. I don't mean I haven't been to a British university since then, but I wasn't on the faculty since I left Cambridge in 1980. So I can't say that I'm super up to date on all of this, but my sense is that we have made more progress, at least in parts of the American university system, than has occurred yet in Britain. So when I went to Clare College in 1972, Skip Gates, whom you mentioned, came in 1973 as a scholar, as a graduate of Yale University, first African-American to come to Clare from the United States. And within a couple of days, he knew that there was a Black person called Kwame Appiah around because people kept saying to him, "Have you met Kwame Appiah?" And the reason was there were only three of us. There was me, there was him, and there was Dapo Ladimeji, who's a Nigerian, who was also doing philosophy. So now that's, I don't know what the numbers are in Clare now, or even at Cambridge, but at least, we've been trying, at least progress has been made in the sense that there now is a recognition that something needs to be done about it at the university that I went to. So I gave some money to a fund that's been started at Cambridge to help with diversification and in this direction, in the Black direction, and it's named after Alexander Crummell, who was the first African American to go to Cambridge, and who went on to be one of the founding fathers of Liberia and was one of the founders of the University of Liberia, and is one of the people celebrated by Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. So he was a Cambridge man, I can say. So I can boast of him both as a founding Pan-Africanist and as a Cambridge person. We got to do more of that. And one of the reasons we got to do more of that is that this idea that the culture of the university, the things that I'm going to talk just about the humanities for the moment, that the things that we are curating in the humanities, in the university, even the ones that have the stamp of Britain on them, they weren't all made by white people. And so you need to acknowledge that. And they're certainly not all being made by white people now. And if you think of the culture as a sort of white thing, you'll both fail to pay attention to what's actually going on, and you'll make people feel excluded from what is otherwise going to be a very vibrant multi-identitarian culture. So I think we got to do that. That's one of the reasons why I talk about people like Anton Wilhelm Amu, who was the was an 18th century Ghanaian who got a PhD in philosophy in Germany and became rector of the university, and then retired to Ghana. And unfortunately, I think the reason he retired was because he got there at the time when racism was growing in Europe, and he eventually felt that it was more comfortable to go back to Ghana, even though he left Ghana at the age of 4, so he didn't know much about Ghana. And anyway, I think we need to talk about these people because the idea that European culture is white is just not true. And it's also not Christian. I mean, that is to say, it's not just Christian, it's also importantly and hugely Jewish and Muslim, and has been since at least the 8th century, the Muslim part. So I think the main argument that I think scholars ought to make here is that the story you're telling isn't true. And our job as scholars is to be carefully attentive to the truth. But it's also important to say that we need to be respectful of the people who are with us. And that's a task beyond the truth. The truth is part of it. And in that process, we do need to acknowledge that we have historically done things and made gestures that were made non-white people feel not at home in our universities. And the point about universities is that they should be universal. They should bring everybody in. They should be sites of undergraduate life in particular, I think, should be a site of discussion and debate among people of all the identities in your society, guided by what they're learning.
Thank you. I think that's a really expansive answer. Actually, in my father's language, which is Igbo, the university is translated as Mahadum, the place where the world comes to.
Oh, great, perfect.
And you can't understand that unless you understand a bit of Igbo, because you don't.
Yes, exactly. Good. Yes.
Right. I've got a technical question for you from Bois Appiah. How does Cedric Robinson's understanding of race fit into Du Bois' concept of race?
I don't know. I mean, well, so just to say, the one reason I don't know is because I have written a book about Du Bois's ideas about race, and he keeps changing. There isn't one story, but maybe your questioner could say what it is about the Robinson ideas that you're trying to play off against the.
Well, I think Buhari, what you could do is, if you send an email, I'm sure I can send it to Anthony and he'll be able to give you a personalized response, please. Yes,
good, of course.
But
I mean, the answer is it's very difficult to, Du Bois thought about these things for about 70 years and wrote a whole shelf of books and articles and essays and letters. And he was a very deep thinker, and so he changed his mind about things as time went on, and his notion of race develops. I think he's sort of ahead of the curve in the sense that he's already a kind of social constructionist in 1911, and when the term, of course, did not exist. But he's already seeing the point that races are socio-historical and not biological long before most European or anywhere else intellectuals really did. But that isn't the whole story, because that's 1911, and he lives another 50 years, and he's as I say, a deep thinker.
But I think also that this goes back to the fact that Du Bois actually dies in Ghana. He leaves and goes to move to Ghana,
and he dies as a Ghanaian.
Exactly.
He's a Ghanaian citizen when he dies. And Nkrumah gave him Ghanaian citizenship, and he threw away his American passport. So he didn't just. It wasn't a dual citizen. He gave up his American citizenship. And of course, that was because he had given up on racial progress in America. And one amazing thing about Du Bois, he had great timing, was he died the night before Martin Luther King made the speech in the Mall on Washington. And in fact, his death was announced in the Mall on Washington because a telegram arrived. I think if you talk to him, if he'd lived a few days longer, he might have had a slightly different vision. And he did say in 1954, when Brown v. Board of Education was decided and the Supreme Court of the United States essentially said that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional, he did say, "I've seen the impossible happen." So he was beginning, he wasn't as completely giving up on the United States. But of course, after 1954, we're still in the McCarthy era. He was actually prosecuted as an unregistered foreign agent because anybody who said anything remotely communist was charged. He was acquitted, however, by an American jury. So that's good.
Okay. Question from William Acker. I can't believe this. Is this William Acker from Liverpool a long time ago? Anyway, here's the question. Do you think future articulations of Pan-Africanism still need to be based on land, i.e. unification of Africa, or can we speak of a deterritorialized Pan-Africanism that focuses on equality and dignity of persons? So how critical is the land to the idea?
Well, I think the answer is that we need to do both those things, and that's why Du Bois thought that the problem of the color line had two strands. It had the strand of building Africa, the continent. And in doing the building of Africa, it's very important, I think the question puts it the right way, to focus on the land, which means that this is not a racial project if you're talking about Black and Arab. It is a continental project. Africa contains now a significant Boer-speaking white population, significant, huge Arab and Berber-speaking populations who are not, on some people's accounting, Black people. Some Egyptians would certainly count as Black in New York City, but some of them wouldn't. So, if Africa and the African Union is right about this, the African Union and Nkrumah got this right from the very start because he worked with Nasser and people like that to make sure that the African Union wasn't even though he was a Pan-Africanist, he wasn't exclusivist about what Africa meant to him, and he did build in the idea that Africa had to be, he wanted Africa to be one. And what does that mean? I think my view is that the ideal version of the European Union isn't a bad model, not the actual messy thing that exists. But that is to say, I don't believe that you want a government in Addis Ababa that is elected by everybody and running everything. I think it's good to have national, to be a community of nations. And I think that I would say a community of nations which are internally federally organized, because democracy, lots of things in democracy work best if they're as close as possible to people. So that the people of the city of Pennington, where I happen to be at the moment, and city is a courtesy because it's got 3,000 people, they vote about how to run the local schools. I think that's a good thing. I don't think that it would be good to have UNESCO deciding these things in Paris about education in Pennington. So I think my own view is a sort of federation of Africa view, in which you have states which themselves, as I say, are divided regionally by land into sub-states, but highly integrated, economically integrated, with integration of the dealing with crime. You need, criminal organizations don't care about borders, so you need collaboration across states to manage people who are trading arms and drugs illegally. You need clearly collaboration, as we can all now see, to deal with health problems. The locusts that travel across Africa don't care about national boundaries. We need to deal with those kind of agricultural problems together. There's an organization called the Organization for the Mise en Valeur of the Niger River, because the Niger River Basin, because that is an ecological zone, and in that zone, for example, the problems of eye infections. Again, eye infections don't care whether you're on which side of the border you're on. So I think we need to do lots of transnational collaboration, and of course, we should be open to collaboration with all the other regions of the world. But I like the idea of building up from local shared land. But the other part of the that process can be helped and strengthened by connections with a deterritorialized diaspora. African Americans really did help make sure that push the policies of the United States, both domestically and internationally in the 1960s, away from racism and in favor of decolonization. And those two fights potentiated each other. The fact that there were now states with votes in the United Nations, which are black states, meant that the racism and the formal institutionalized racism in the United States was becoming more costly in diplomatic terms for the United States. So people in the State Department were writing to the Justice Department saying, you know, if we don't do something about what's going on in the Jim Crow South, it's making our lives very hard. And in particular, it's making our lives hard because it's wonderful propaganda for our communist enemies to say these are the guys who talk about freedom and they don't even know how to give freedom to their own people. So there's a potentiation. I don't think we need to think of these as either or, because the deterritorialized black identity is something, you know, I don't know whether it'll last 1,000 years, but right now in many places in the world, that deterritorialized African identity, black identity, is useful to people, and so, you know, why get rid of it? In fact, why not use it for the things that it's useful for? But that's a matter of picking the right, what I called aperture.
Right, Lynn Innes has a question. Do you see any problem in the acceptance by African Americans of the identification imposed by European Americans, e.g. that somebody who is only a 1/32th African is identified as black? So this is the colorism that Paul Gilroy talks about. You know,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, it isn't even just 1/32nd. In principle, any old, you know, if you can prove you got any African ancestry under the law in many places in the Jim Crow South, you were black. Look, this identity is the product of history. And I would say, more accurately, histories. And the histories that produce the African American identity include a history in which, if you had an African ancestor, an identifiable African ancestor, you were governed by the law as a black person. You were enslavable, which white people were not. You could be required not to sit in certain parts of restaurants, not to shop in certain shops, not to drink from certain soda fountains, not to go on certain buses and trains. And that was an experience that you had because you were classified as a Negro. And you could be classified as a Negro indeed, with only 1/32nd of your ancestry coming from Africa, or less actually. But because I don't believe in sort of biological race, I don't think there's a correct answer to this question. We have to decide what we're going to do. I think it was so here's an example of the value of that expansive notion of African American identity. In the middle of the 20th century, an organization that Du Bois helped start, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is a leading anti-racist organization in this country and has been for a century, was headed by a man whose name, perhaps ironically, was Walter White. Now, but the irony about Walter White wasn't just that his name was white. He looked white. He had blue eyes and fair skin. But he was proud of being a Negro, and he led that organization and its struggles against, for example, lynching. And he had a powerful tool in his armory. He could go into white communities and not be seen to be black. He could pass for white. And he used that tool in his struggles as head of the NAACP to investigate what was going on in communities where the arrival of a black man in an expensive suit would have led to his being followed around all the time and not being able to do the work he wanted to do. I'm not going to kick Walter White out of the black race because I don't think he had more than a certain percentage of certain, as they say in the American law about Indians, blood quantum of of blackness. He identified with black people. He served the cause of black people. He was passionately and powerfully anti-racist. Why would you turn somebody like that away? But you do have, I said histories, and you do have to recognize that in Brazil, for example, another country with a large population of African descent, the boundaries are drawn in different places. Walter White could not have been negro. He could not have been black in Brazil. And that doesn't mean he couldn't have been anti-racist. Of course he could, but it doesn't mean. And so in that country, the way in which you participate in black identity is just different from what it is in some other countries. And so for those people, for people thinking about Pan-Africanism, it's different. Now, I should say, I've been to Brazil. I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately, but I've been to Brazil. And I went, when the first time I went because somebody published a translation of a book of mine about African identity. And one of the really interesting things to me about Brazil is there, you can say, of course, I'm not Negro, I'm not black because I don't have a black skin, but I have African ancestry and I'm proud of it. Right. And lots of white looking people said that to me in Brazil. So again, the stories are different in different places. That makes it important when you're trying to bring people together to recognize the diversity of your histories and experiences and to figure out what you can do together. And here I go back to my point about decolonization and democracy. What you do isn't to be decided by you or me. It's to be decided in conversation among equal people who are trying to figure out how to make sense of the world together.
Great. Right. The bar is still open virtually. And whilst I wait for the last few questions, I'm going to insert another question of my own. So,
okay.
I mean, Anthony, you've got this amazing kind of repertoire of things you do, moral philosophy, and so on. But now as you kind of, I guess, look back over your X years of being an intellectual or a social and a cultural commentator, do you think that as we are getting, I guess, a younger generation who are actually much more cosmopolitan, both in terms of their bloodlines and so on, has this begun to change the thinking? Because again, I guess particularly because you're on that side of the pond where various things are happening. Or are we still there? I must admit, from an architectural perspective, because my discipline is architecture, I mean, the Museum of Lynching kind of scares me. But then again, we've got, your countryman Museum of Black Cultural History in Washington.
In Washington, yes. And by the way, Sir David has done the designs for the new Du Bois Center in Accra.
Oh, there you are. What can I say? And then there's the whole Afropolitanism movement, which I was asked to comment on. So, where are we?
I think, well, I only, I'm a professor, so I see only a slice of the population. Of the young population. I see the people who come through my classes, and they are not just Americans. Right now, because of the pandemic, I'm teaching all my classes on Zoom, and every week I'm talking to kids in China and India and Australia who come to the classes. And so I get a very diverse slice of the world's people, but I get a diverse slice of the world's people who have decided that they want to go to university in a cosmopolitan city. So they've left people behind who may not be as cosmopolitan as they are, or who may be sticking to the places that they're in because they don't want to go elsewhere. I'm always thinking about the people who lived in the house across the street from us when I was a child, next to my grandparents. There's a big family, huge house and big family. And the Mr. Nyantit, whose house it was, had a number of wives and a lot of children. One of those children was the first Ghanaian to get Japanese citizenship. And another of them is Spanish. And some live in London, and at least one is in New York. And then there are the ones who stayed in Kumasi, right? So people are different. Some people want to travel and meet things, and other people want to stay where they are. And that's how people are. But the thing that you're pointing to in terms of sort of the the increasing frequency of a new kind of transnational mixture is very important part of this. And again, I'm very conscious of this. I have two great nephews and a great niece. My the first of the great nephews is a Nigerian citizen. And his father is a British citizen, British and Nigerian citizen, as was his father. And his mother is my sister, and so he has through her Ghanaian and British ancestry. And his uncle just married a young woman who's half Ghanaian and half Nigerian, as he is, or at least part Ghanaian, part Nigerian. He's got other things in him. But that's the least complicated of them, because my youngest, the youngest of the great nephews, is a half Namibian, a quarter Norwegian, an eighth British, and an eighth Ghanaian. And his first cousin swapped a Namibian mother for a Russian mother. And they're all cousins, and they're about the same age, and they live in 3 different countries, but they know each other because we're a prosperous family. We can come together from time to time. And anyway, we can get together on Zoom now, and we do. So I don't see how you say to someone who has that ancestry, you belong in only one place. I just don't think it makes much sense. And furthermore, they won't accept it. The feistiest of them is probably my great niece in London, who's half Russian. She would never, nobody's going to be able to boss her about and tell her that she can't be British, but also that she can't be, if she chooses, Russian or Norwegian. She has Norwegian ancestry, and so on. So, or African, Ghanaian, because she has Ghanaian ancestry. So I think those people are going to force us to reject the idea, which is actually in one of the slogans of Pan-Africanism, though I don't think it was meant this way, which is one nation, one people, one destiny. I think all of us can think of ourselves as having many identities, belonging to many destinies, and that those of us who have a claim on an African identity or a Black identity can hold on to it while still, I'm Black, but I'm also I have as much claim on Britain as anybody, and I have a perfect claim on the United States because I have an American passport which I got legally. So I think that's my feeling is we're going to, that because of the phenomenon you pointed to, we're going to have to live that way. And we need to live that way. Look at what has the pandemic told us? The pandemic told us that you can't stop a bug moving by drawing a border. You can only stop a bug moving by collaborating together through the World Health Organization to find solutions and to take measures. The appalling behavior of our own president here in the United States, pulling out of the WHO in the middle of a pandemic, is totally counterproductive, stupid, preposterous, and unhelpful.
Right. Well, I'm going to let you go after there are 2 questions that I'm going to roll into one, and then we'll let you go.
Okay.
So Evan Bailey has essentially asked whether we should prioritize the focus of those at the bottom when we're looking at counter-discrimination work. And I think this ties to your lecture and the way in which you said that in some ways we always hear about the intellectuals who are at these conferences, but the conferences really were about others who were not necessarily at the table, the farmers and others. And we've also got Helena Kettleborough, who's asking whether you think Pan-Africanism had a link, or what do you think it had in relation to the today's green movement? Is that right? The ecological movement. So was there anything around sustainability? Then we'll wrap up.
Well, the African Union has been very involved in developing the UN sustainability goals that we now have. So, and that's because you'd have to be an idiot not to recognize that Africa has a huge stake in getting these things right. Climate change is doing enormous damage in Africa, and unless we make significant moves on that, and we here means everybody, the world, it's going to be even worse. So yeah, but as I say, I think there is a genuine awareness of this in the AU, and they have participated in the development of the UN sustainability goals and so on. Sorry, what was the first thing was about?
This was about whether we should prioritize the needs of
good. Yes.
the voices and
Two things. One, as I stressed, fundamentally, I think we should see decolonization, which was a central strand of the form of Pan-Africanism of 1945, as about democratization. And democracy is about voice. It's about many things, but one of the things is giving voice to everybody. And this is a problem we need to face up to more in Ghana and in Nigeria and in Zimbabwe and in South Africa and in Kenya and in I'm not going to recite the list of all the names of the countries in the African Union. We have a serious problem. The Nigerians at the moment are doing a popular struggle against oppressive policing, inspired, I think, by BLM. Great, because it's absolutely essential that we do that. We can't, when I read about that, I was reminded of this, one of my formative experiences. So I was a young man, I was a professor, I was a teaching assistant at the University of Ghana at Legon near Accra. And I was probably certainly the lowest paid person on campus, which meant that I only had 2 servants. And one weekend I went to stay with my family in Kumasi, and I came back and they weren't there. And I asked my neighbor where they might be, and he said, "Oh, they're probably down at the police station." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, well, they just lock people up from time to time." I said, "But that's okay." So I walked down to the police. I didn't have a car, so I walked down to the police station. So that was how poor I was. And I said, "You don't happen to have these people who work for me?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what do they do?" He said, "They're bad boys." And I said, "But that's in this country, you have to commit an offense in order to be locked up by the police. So what was the offense?" He said, "No, they didn't really do anything." So I said, "Well, would you mind giving them back to me?" And he said, "Sure." And he brought them out of the cell, and they were in their underwear, and they were embarrassed. So they laughed, and he hit them in front of me. And that was one of the most shocking experiences of my life, because I realized that I had lived that would never have happened to me in Ghana, right? I lived in a country. And when we went home, I said to them, that really isn't supposed to happen. I'd like to try and do something about it. And they said the correct thing. They said, "How long are you going to be here? You can't give us the power to stop him. You have access to that power." I just told them that my father was on the police council, so he could have disciplined this man because he was president of the Bar Association. And and they said, "Please don't, because he'll find us. If you cause trouble for him, he'll find us." Now, that for me, having sort of grown up in the household of a lawyer who did do pro bono cases, who at his funeral, somebody kindly said that my father invented pro bono practice in Ghana, the idea that you did cases for poor people because they couldn't afford it. And he did a lot of them, and he used the great writ, habeas corpus, to get people out of jail. But I thought, well, so basically things were okay. And what did I know? It was terrible for ordinary people. Ordinary people had no faith at all. They couldn't get lawyers. They couldn't get access to the justice system, and they were being regularly abused by police. So we need to do something about that, we in Africa. And I'm glad that this movement in Nigeria is doing what it's doing. So yes, that's very important. But also, and this was, Du Bois was actually, by the end of his life, a communist, so he did care about economic justice. But he, for most of his life, he would have said he was a socialist. Socialism is a big strand in the history of Pan-Africanism, understood in an African way. So it's African socialism, but it does at its heart have the idea that above all else, government is about securing the living conditions of regular people, of ordinary people, and that means in Africa, poor people. So Pan-Africanism ought to be very focused, as we all ought to be, and on questions of economic inequality. And I put them this way: the really important questions about inequality, economic inequality, are twofold, I think. One is, they're problems of poverty. We need to get to a world where nobody lives in debilitating poverty and everybody has the economic conditions for dignity. That's perfectly consistent with having differences in income between different people, but it's not consistent with the current situation, where a situation now being made worse by the pandemic, because probably 300 million people are going to be who were taken out of poverty over the last few decades are going to be thrown back into poverty because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. So it's an even more urgent problem now. But the other thing that's important is that inequalities of money are associated with inequalities of political power. And I'm back to my voice point. We need to change the world, and that focusing on this as a problem in Africa, because that's one of the, not because it isn't the problem everywhere, but because it's what we're thinking about in part today. We've got to figure out a better way of not allowing our politics to be dominated by money. And when I say we, I mean Ghanaians and Nigerians and Senegalese, but I also mean Americans and British. It's probably a worse problem probably in the United States than almost anywhere, but it's a terrible problem in Africa. It's different in different places, but it's a terrible. And for example, it's not as bad in Botswana. So there are moments of hope in Africa. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, but it's not unfair, I think, to make this as a point about Africa, because it's a point about the world. It's not really just a point about Africa. Money has too much. The rich have too much, especially the very rich, the top 0.1%, have too much political power almost everywhere. And that means that ordinary people, especially poor people, do not have enough. And so we should worry not just about the economic conditions of the poor, we should worry about their political circumstances and their voice, in part because if we get that right, we'll probably be able to get the economic stuff right, because they will insist on it. Amartya Sen, the great Indian British economist, has a beautiful piece of work in which he shows that famines don't happen in democracies. And the reason for that is that in democracies, the government has to care about what ordinary people think, and famines hurt ordinary people.
That's a very good way to wrap up. I'd like to thank Anthony profusely for sharing both his talk and his time with us. And I think on behalf of the Pan-African celebrations at 75, particularly, we would really want to forge alliances with the work you're doing in Ghana, because we are actually talking about the same thing, that we do need places to study and have this history known about. We feel that this has really been an eye-opening talk in itself, but it would be fantastic to start to forge these links.
Mm-hmm.
But again, and hopefully again, when this current epidemic disappears, we can actually have you over here physically to walk the streets and see what Manchester is today. But I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you immensely for this really, really enlightening evening.
It was a pleasure, and I enjoyed the questions very much, and thank you for them.
Thank you. Keep safe, everybody. See you tomorrow.